3:44 a.m. Gvardiskaya. The technical crew is still conducting pressure checks and recording data. Everything is proceeding like a routine shift. But they have no idea. In just 12 minutes, this place will turn into a massive pillar of fire rising 2,000 feet high, lighting up the entire Crimean sky. This was not merely an explosion, it was the opening salvo of a tactical operation targeting the enemy's aorta. At this point, Moscow was struggling with a severe energy shortage to sustain the momentum of its entire southern campaign. Gvardiskaya is not only a fueling station for the Black Sea Fleet, but also the sole lifeline for tens of thousands of armored units striving to hold the line from Donetsk all the way to Zaporizhzhia. If this heart is destroyed, Russia will not only lose an oil depot, but also face a domino effect of disruptions across its entire southern logistics system, severely impacting everything from tank and aircraft resupply to fleet operations. And Ukraine's first move involves hundreds of drones scattered across regions from Krasnodar, Belgorod, Bryansk, Rostov, Kaluga, Kursk, all the way to Crimea. While Russia is confident in its defense systems and believes it can control the situation, they are completely unaware. It is precisely these seemingly harmless drones that will deliver the decisive blow to their lifeline. The reason Ukraine chose to launch hundreds of drones into a death zone already bristling with fire was not because they wanted to strike harder, but because they had no other choice. They lacked air superiority. They could not launch a large-scale conventional attack. Nor can they directly penetrate an air defense system designed to intercept everything that flies in. Therefore, the challenge is no longer how to hit the target, but how to force the enemy to open the door. And to break a defense system worth billions of dollars, Ukraine began with a bold, sacrificial move. 3:23 a.m. In the murky corridors above the Black Sea, the first wave began to form. From various directions, FPVs were released, flying in scattered formations. But this was a deliberate choice, as Ukraine knew full well if they concentrated their formation, they would be wiped out in just a few minutes. And then, the moment the first signals hit Russian radar screens, immediately nearly 20 of the first FP5s surged toward Krasnodar. Within seconds, the Russian radar network detected the signals. There was no hesitation. The Panzer S-1 batteries switched from standby to firing mode. The radar locked onto targets, and the 30mm cannons fired at a rate of thousands of rounds per minute. Bright red tracer trails ripped through the night. At the same time, the S-400 launchers were activated. Lock on a Russian air defense officer bellowed over the internal channel, the launch tubes popped open, and the 4 OON-6E missiles launched nearly vertically before making a sharp turn, leaving long trails of white smoke across the night sky. The air was shattered by shock waves. Each FPV locked onto its target shook violently, lost stability, then exploded into blazing fireballs, falling like half-burned shooting stars. At the same time, scattered across Belgorod and Kursk, 23 other FP5s also closed in simultaneously. Russia immediately expanded its intercept network, additional targets heading north. The information is relayed to each battery. The book fires first. The 9M317 missiles launch at an angle slicing across the sky, heading straight for the distant signals. The Tor M2 responds immediately afterward. The 9M330 missiles launch vertically, rising like short columns of fire. Missiles were launched in dense salvos, tracking even the smallest signals. Explosions flashed continuously in the sky, precise, cold, and effective. Every decoy drone was eliminated. In the eyes of the Russians, this was a perfect sky-clearing operation. The Russians believed they were crushing the enemy's will, but in reality they were merely squandering precious resources on a meticulously staged spectacle. Yet they failed to realize every shot fired was a colossal expense being burned away, in exchange for targets of almost no value. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front lines, Ukrainian control engineers silently watch each signal disappear, because for them every explosion isn't a failure, but a step closer to the true objective. 3:34 a.m. Just a few minutes later, as the smoke from the first intercept hadn't yet cleared, Ukraine took the cat-and-mouse game to a whole new level. At low altitude, hugging the edges of residential areas and forest paths north of Crimea, the Baba Yaga drones had taken position minutes earlier. Each carried 4 FPV. And as Russian radar slowed its pace after the first wave of intercepts, they released the Bs. More than 20 FPV surged out simultaneously, hugging the terrain, immediately splitting into different directions and accelerating toward Bryansk. Just a few seconds later, the radar screens in Bryansk flickered frantically. And this time, Russia wasn't just using missiles. Low-altitude target opened fire. The anti-aircraft artillery positions fired at full capacity. Large-caliber automatic cannons along with heavy machine guns of 12.7 millimeters and 14.5 millimeters opened fire simultaneously. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the sky, forming a dense wall of fire as thick as steel. The sky shook with the relentless roar of explosions. Ukrainian FPVs tried to weave through, making sharp turns, diving and changing direction constantly like acrobats. But against such intense fire, some were hit spinning wildly before exploding. Others were torn apart mid-air. Flaming metal fragments fell glinting in the darkness before fading away. Before Russia could stabilize its formation, about 20 more drones surged into Rostov, Kaluga, and Crimea. By now, Russia's air defense system was stretched to its absolute limit. S-400 opened fire! The commander's voice bellowed hoarsely. Instantly, the S-400 swiveled their barrels. Massive 4 ON-6E missiles once again left their launch tubes, leaving blinding streaks of light that jammed the optical sensors. The entire air defense network was no longer operating as a coordinated system, but rather like isolated muscles reacting under overload. The sky turned into a labyrinth of light where everything was moving, everything was exploding. The drones were being hunted from all sides. They were hit repeatedly, bursting into flames, then fading away, leaving only thin trails of black smoke dissipating into the air. As the final signals vanished from the radar, the battlefield suddenly fell silent. In the distance, the Baba Yaga begins to retreat. But in the sky, 2 Russian patrol aircraft are still sweeping low along the coastal area, part of the post-interception control loop. And this time they've picked up something. A weak signal. Moving slowly, unlike any previous target. Immediately, both aircraft descend, accelerate, and charge forward the distance covered by the second. The last Baba Yaga entered the lock-on zone. A streak of light sliced through the night. Impact. The mother drone exploded mid-air, turning into a massive fireball that illuminated the entire sky. In the Ukrainian control room, warning sirens blared incessantly. The remaining Baba Yagas immediately shut off all their signal lights. They dropped to just above the treetops, flying so close that a deviation of just a few meters would result in a collision. Maintain altitude. Shut off emissions. Follow the terrain. The Ukrainian commander's orders came out short and decisive. At this moment, the forest's rugged terrain and electronic jamming became their final shield. They slipped through every gap, narrowly avoiding collisions multiple times, until they finally vanished from the tracking screens. At the Russian command centers, the atmosphere erupted. Officers slapped each other on the back. Soldiers cheered and clapped in celebration. In their eyes, the sky had been cleared. A perfect victory. Proof of an impenetrable air defense network. While the Russians were celebrating a target-free sky, the reality was that their system had been stretched thin. Krasnodar was straining its firepower. Belgorod and Kursk were still experiencing jamming signals. Bryansk and Kaluga maintained a high alert. And that was the problem, because when the entire system was stretched thin in so many directions, a gap began to form. On the southwest flank, a seemingly quiet stretch of sea, where there were no dense alerts, no overwhelming signals, and not enough firepower on standby. 3:40 a.m. From that very direction, a completely different reality is quietly advancing. 14 FP-1 assassins are maintaining an altitude of just 120 feet. They were launched from the Ukrainian border hours earlier, silently traversing hundreds of kilometers of enemy territory, slipping through radar gaps, evading every layer of surveillance like non-existent shadows. This is no longer a mere provocation. It is a deep strike at the geopolitical Achilles heel that Moscow is desperately trying to protect. For if Gvardeyskaya is lost, the entire Black Sea Fleet will be nothing more than stationary blocks of iron on the water. And to safeguard that infiltration, Ukraine deployed F-16, releasing a barrage of decoys and chaff, creating bands of metal debris and false targets that erupted like a massive reflective cloud. Within seconds, a blind spot lasting 5 to 7 minutes emerged enough time for the fighters to slip through. As soon as they detected the signal, Russia immediately brought its Panzer S-1 and Tor M2 systems into full combat readiness. 30mm cannons fired relentlessly. 9 M330 missiles were launched continuously. But this barrage of fire failed to find its target. Lost the target, a Russian radar crew reported in a flustered tone. In the command cabin, the Russian officer frowned, his eyes darting quickly across the screens. A moment of hesitation, a moment of doubt. He believed this was merely a technical glitch, a malfunction in the sensor network, not an actual intrusion. And it was that delay in recognition that opened the most dangerous window of opportunity. Right within that precious window, 14 FP-1 accelerated simultaneously. Maintaining an altitude of 120 feet, they skimmed close to the terrain, heading straight for the Gvardiyskaya oil depot, the fuel lifeline sustaining the entire Black Sea Fleet and Russian forces in the south. And then, a variable that Ukraine hadn't anticipated had emerged. Mobile Pol 21 jamming stations began activating. Electronic waves swept across the battlefield. Instantly, the 4 FP-1 signals on Ukraine's control screens began flickering, distorting, then vanished completely. No explosion, not shot down, simply erased from the control screen. This was the home field advantage. Russia still possessed layers of defense that Ukraine couldn't fully see. 3:45 a.m. For a few brief seconds, the Ukrainian side froze, but the reaction came almost immediately. Break formation, push the decoy layer forward, a Ukrainian officer ordered in a cold, sharp tone. Immediately, the first attack wave of 6 FP-1 was pushed forward. Among them, 4 suddenly surged to an altitude of 250 feet, deliberately exposing themselves. The Russian side took the bait immediately. The Tor M2 radar locked onto the targets. The 9 M330 missile launched from its mount with extreme acceleration, streaking straight into the sky. 3 FP-1s were hit head-on, exploding into fragments. The 4th couldn't change course in time, plowing straight through the fire zone. A barrage of anti-aircraft fire sliced through its fuselage, causing it to lose control. Then it tumbled to the ground in a long trail of fire. However, that sacrifice bought a precious window of opportunity. The 5th FP-1, maintaining a low altitude and minimal emissions, silently followed the pre-calculated flight path. No maneuvers, no weaving, simply unseen, and it headed straight for the Pol 21 transmission station. The distance closed. No final adjustments, no hesitation. A direct kinetic impact. Boom! The jammer station exploded. The primary transmitter was wiped out, restoring visibility to the entire rear guidance system. In the Russian command center, the sense of triumph vanished in mere seconds. At first there was silence, a brief pause as if the system hadn't yet processed what had just happened. Then everything erupted simultaneously. Jamming signal lost. Who's reporting? An officer rushed to the control console, slamming his hand down on the panel. His eyes were fixed on the screen, flashing error codes. And without giving Russia any time to react, FP-1, number 6, continued its charge. This time's target, the main fuel pipeline. Impact. A deep resonant explosion. The steel structure was torn apart. Fuel began spewing out under high pressure, forming a chaotic stream. It quickly vaporized, forming a thick column of black smoke that engulfed the area. And once the fuel ignited, it was no longer a military target, but an irreversible disaster. In the Russian command center, there was no silence this time. Everything exploded simultaneously. The display panels turned red in sequence. Data streams flickered, overlapped, and fell into chaos. The commander clenched his fists. His gaze swept across the entire screen where one area after another slipped out of control. And in a few brief seconds, everything slipped from their grasp. 3:51 a.m. And just as a column of black smoke from the torn open pipeline began to rise, spreading and obscuring the entire lower observation deck at an altitude of just about 100 feet, 4 FP-1, assassins officially revealed themselves. They were no longer radar signals, but real objects hurtling straight toward the heart of a system Moscow had once believed to be impenetrable. Realizing the imminent danger, the Russian side reacted in a state of panic. Low-altitude target lock on immediately. The Russian commander's voice was no longer a command, but a panicked reflex. Instantly, the radar locks onto the target. The Panzer S-1 rotates its turret. The Tor M2 switches to low-altitude target tracking mode. Within seconds, fire opens. 30mm cannons sweep across the sky, tracer rounds crisscrossing into a web. The 9 M330 missile launches from its mount, soaring upward at a steep intercept angle. The lead FP-1 was locked onto first. A fragmentation warhead sliced across its flight path. The drone's body jerked violently, veering off course, then exploded mid-air. A fireball erupted right in front of the target. Debris rained down, failing to reach the storage tanks. And that sacrifice shielded the remaining 3. The remaining 3 slipped through, No change in course, no deceleration. On a battlefield where every second is choked by firepower, even the smallest opening is enough to alter the entire situation. FP-1 number 2 aimed directly at the brain of the entire complex, the central control system. Impact! A deep-seated explosion erupted from the core of the structure. Shockwaves reverberating outward, shattering windows and snapping the outer framework. Inside the Russian command center, everything collapsed instantly. Radar screens went white with static. Surveillance cameras stuttered, then went dark one after another. Red lights flashed frantically in the darkness. The warning siren tore through the air. Radar lost signal, screens down. The commander's voice cracked over the radio, choppy and drowned in static. He gripped his headset, eyes fixed on the pitch-black screen. For the first time that night, there was no data left to make a decision. 3:56 a.m. No pause. No time to process what had just happened. The last two plunged nearly simultaneously. One left. One right. FP-1 number 3 locked onto the main fuel tank, the largest fuel reservoir in the entire complex. FP-1 number 4 aimed straight for the central pipeline cluster, the pressure convergence point. The distance closed. Speed remained constant. Double impact. Boom, boom, 2 explosions occurred almost simultaneously. A massive surge of pressure was instantly released. A fireball erupted, engulfing the entire central area. The flames shot straight up, soaring over 2,000 feet, not only illuminating Crimea, but also exposing the helplessness of a multi-billion-dollar defense system. The heat wave spread in a hemispherical pattern, blasting everything around it. Black smoke billowed violently, rising to 4,000 to 5,000 feet, blanketing the entire Crimean sky. In that moment, the entire strategic significance of Crimea as a vital refueling station began to collapse in the literal physical sense. In the command bunker, the Russian commander's face turned from flushed red to deathly pale in an instant. He stood motionless. He gave no orders. He showed no reaction. He simply stared at the blank screens. Everything happened too fast, faster than the ability to comprehend and react of a system designed to control everything. Outside, Russian soldiers rushed to the scene. Fire hoses were brought in. Water sprayed out, but was immediately swallowed up by the sea of fire. The pressure was too weak. The temperature was too high. All efforts became futile. The Panzer S-1, Tor M2, and even S-400 systems continued to fire, but now they were firing into a thick, impenetrable cloud of smoke. There were no targets, no signals, just reflexes. A multi-billion-dollar air defense system firing blindly. A system once designed to counter modern warfare, now reacting like a disoriented organism. 6:30 a.m. Dawn over the Crimean Peninsula comes not from the sun, but from a thick black column of smoke rising 5,000 feet high, still billowing upward. The fire raged for hours after the explosion, reducing the entire Gvardiskaya oil depot infrastructure to a twisted heap of rubble glowing red from the intense heat. Russia has just lost hundreds of millions of dollars in fuel directly from its so-called $5 billion oil and gas empire. But in reality, that financial loss pales in comparison to the logistical nightmare now beginning to unfold. And just a few hours after the explosion, supply lines began to falter. Fuel convoys were backed up, rerouted, and stretched into long, easily detectable lines. On the front lines in Donbass and Zaporizhia, the pace of operations began to slow. It wasn't an immediate collapse, but it was enough to create a delay. And in war, a delay is more than enough. Armored units were forced to recalculate every maneuver. The Air Force reduced the frequency of sorties. The Black Sea Fleet remained in position longer than expected. Not because they cannot fight, but because they cannot sustain the same level of attrition as before. At the same time, over the skies of Crimea, another problem has emerged. The air defense system, once considered impenetrable, has been thrown off balance, led astray, and ultimately breached. Ukraine has proven that they don't need a sledgehammer to crack the vault. They just need a handful of cheap, intelligent drones to burn everything inside to the ground. It's like a needle piercing an artery, a small, almost invisible wound, but the flow behind it collapses beyond repair. Bye for now.